the nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The abyss. May the 2nd, 1941. Senior Nazi officials gather for a meeting in Berlin. Presiding is Herbert Backe, State Secretary in the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture.
Herbert Backe war einer für die jüngere Generation.
Backe is what you would call a typical younger Nazi high achiever. He was both an ideological fanatic and a political pragmatist.
Bezeichnete sich selbst als Leistungsmenschen.
Top of the agenda is nothing less than the planned mass murder of millions by starvation. The hunger plan is to be implemented right after the Wehrmacht has invaded the Soviet Union. Vast quantities of grain and cattle will be siphoned off, stolen to feed the army, and shipped back to the Reich. Millions will die from famine.
This is a systematic, deliberate policy designed to starve the Soviet civilian population. It has been integral to military planning from the start.
There was going to be a quick victory, and then they would starve these people. First year would be 12 million, and then, you know, quite soon 30 million people. I mean, the concept is so unbelievable, it's so horrific. But this was carefully detailed, Herbert Backe and his team in Berlin.
The hunger plan is just one piece of an inhuman strategy. German farmers will replace entire populations of Russians and Ukrainians, turning the East into German Lebensraum, ethnically cleansed living space.
It's been meticulously planned. German settlements was spread from Crimea all the way to Leningrad, the kernel of a new empire of land and slave labor.
A vision that Hitler shared with his German military as early as 1933.
A few days after being first elected, Hitler used a speech to his generals to tell them, you can only Germanize foreign soil, not foreign people. They must be replaced by Germans.
So this is a phased plan, a military conquest to be fed by the hunger plan, in which the Soviet urban population will be starved, and to make space then for a program of German settlement.
This hunger plan is one element of the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, and not even the most ruthless. The Wehrmacht intends to ignore all the rules of war.
With regard to the hunger plan, everyone in the military administration is deliberately brought into the circle. This is not a closely held secret, on the contrary. This is the official policy of the German army in the East.
The gate to hell has burst open. The previous year, in May 1940, a former army barracks in newly conquered western Poland near the small town of Auschwitz is converted into a concentration camp.
A fairly orthodox concentration camp, and that's what Auschwitz I was when it was established in the aftermath of the invasion of Poland for Polish political prisoners.
Before there were gas chambers or a plan to kill Europe's Jews, long before the decision even to invade the Soviet Union, hundreds of Polish political prisoners and POWs were dying from starvation, forced labor, and summary executions. Hitler's immediate priority is to secure his power over Europe. By summer 1940, the map of Europe has been completely withdrawn. Germany and her allies dominate half of it.
The conquest of Western Europe in 1940 certainly encouraged Hitler, even more than before, to believe in his own greatness. Not just political greatness, diplomatic greatness, but also military greatness.
Despite Hitler's quick-fire victories, the war is not yet won. Late summer 1940. For 4 months, the Royal Air Force holds off the Luftwaffe. Unlike France, Britain is not going to fall. Fighter Command's dogged resistance makes a German invasion impossible. German bombers reduce British cities to rubble. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Glasgow. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill refuses any negotiation with the Germans.
Britain has the largest empire the world has ever known. It has the largest global trading empire the world has ever known. So it can get whatever it wants, basically. And Germany has not defeated Britain in the Battle of Britain. Britain is still there.
After losing the Battle of Britain, time is running out for Hitler.
It's a gamble by a man who knows that he is in a race against time, because the longer the war goes on, the more likely it is for opposition to mount, and in particular, the United States. Time is limited. My life is limited, Führer feel.
Alongside Britain, the only remaining great power in Europe is the Soviet Union, with whom Hitler has a non-aggression pact. But he is not a man who honors agreements. He has never made a secret of his obsessive loathing for Bolshevism. And there is the worry Stalin could ally himself to the British.
The Soviet Union is the only power still capable of taking on the Germans. But if it were defeated, Hitler's principal foe, the British, would have no choice but to come to the negotiating table.
Winter 1939. The Soviet Union invades neighboring Finland, its sights set upon territory once part of Tsarist Russia. Despite being outnumbered, the Finns offer fierce resistance. German generals take note.
If the German army can defeat France in a matter of weeks, it can certainly defeat the Red Army, which has been given a bloody nose by the Finns.
By May 1941, the Germans call a halt to the Blitz over Britain and pull their bombers east, ready to support the Soviet invasion. To the very final moment, Stalin is blindsided.
Stalin had, for various reasons, thought that Hitler was going to invade later. He wasn't ready for the invasion. This is despite the fact that from various sources he was told, both British, French, American, and particularly Japanese sources, that the invasion was imminent. He didn't believe it.
The day before the invasion, a German communist in the armed forces had risked his life by crossing the lines to warn the Russians that an invasion was about to happen, and Stalin had him shot for telling lies.
The German Football Championships. Rapid Vienna are winning 4-3 against Schalke 04. In the crowd is the national team coach Sepp Herberger and world boxing star Max Schmeling. June the 22nd, 1941. As the fans cheer, little do they know the greatest land war in history has just been launched in the east. Just a few hours before kickoff, 3 million Wehrmacht troops crossed the Soviet frontier in what the Germans have named Operation Barbarossa. German forces pour into the Soviet Union, divided into army groups north, center, and south. They cover a vast front line from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In barely 8 weeks, the Baltic states, Belarus, and part of Ukraine are overrun. Among the invading force, there's a medic serving with a forward tank division. Alongside his medical equipment, he has a film camera, as well as pen and paper.
No one can believe the speed of our advance. Nearly 300 kilometers in the last 3 days alone. We are the spearhead of the force. Our job is to locate the enemy, secure our position, and clear the way with lightning skirmishes.
His name is Helmut Machemer, and he's here for very personal reasons. An eye doctor in his mid-30s, he volunteered for the most dangerous posting. His wife Erna is half Jewish, and therefore a target for Nazi persecution. She is back home in Münster with their 3 sons. He's only too aware of the threat she and the children now face. But there is an escape clause. In exceptional cases, the family of a soldier awarded the Iron Cross can be redesignated as Aryan. Machemer is desperate to win the medal to save his wife and family. His letters home and his film footage are full of what he sees and feels on the Eastern Front. But he never forgets his ultimate goal. Operation Barbarossa is no normal war. Every German soldier has been given firm instructions from the top. Red Army political commissars are to be shot on sight. The martial law decree exonerates all German soldiers who commit crimes against Soviet civilians. It is the green light for military atrocities.
It's not just that this is an entirely new kind of war with unprecedentedly brutal rules. It is a war that requires the invading forces to make fundamental decisions. What do they plan to do with the Jews living in the conquered territory? Their answer will involve measures they didn't even take against Polish Jews.
For years, the Nazis have bombarded their soldiers with anti-Semitic propaganda. In Hitler's ideology, the Jews don't just run the Red Army, they are the very agents of Soviet Bolshevism. In the summer of 1941, many hundreds of thousands of Jews now find themselves behind Nazi lines and targets of racial madness.
Der Genozid an den sowjetischen Juden beginnt aber im Grunde genommen.
The genocide of Soviet Jews started on the very first day of the military campaign and then gradually expanded to all other parts of Europe.
Ausgeweitet auf andere Teile Europas.
Behind the Wehrmacht come the Einsatzgruppen, SS troops who hunt down and shoot enemy civilians village by village, especially Jews. These task forces total barely 3,000 men, and yet they are soon killing many times their own number. Task Force A advances through the Baltic region towards Leningrad. Task Force B through Belarus towards Moscow. Task Force C is sent through Ukraine, and Task Force D along the Black Sea coast towards the Caucasus.
The value of a human life on the Eastern Front was nothing to these people, nothing. That you could extinguish a human life with just the snap of a finger. And indeed, there were many of these top SS criminals who actually enjoyed killing and were proud of the numbers of people that they killed.
Ich denke, Württemberg ist reich.
Thousands of Germans have watched Jud Süß, a 1940 Nazi feature film that is a massive hit. One of the most anti-Semitic films ever made, it's a personal favorite of Heinrich Himmler's. He makes sure it's shown to as many SS and police personnel as possible. Many of the invading troops have seen the film too and feel emboldened to regard every Jew as their enemy.
There are significant meetings that take place between SS representatives and representatives of the army. And we know that from the documentation, that there are orders and directives issued which allow the army to either approve of or participate in attacks on civilians.
The Einsatzgruppen are commanded by the head of the SS Reich Main Security Office, Reinhard Heydrich, second in command to Himmler himself.
Next to Hitler and Himmler, Heydrich is without doubt one of the central figures in the escalation of anti-Jewish persecution in the Holocaust, a role he has played since the mid-30s, well before the Jewish question held the central priority for Himmler that it would later.
His strategy is to incite local anti-Semites in the occupied territories to attack Jews, a policy with benefits for German forces.
As many people as possible will be involved in the killing process. Many of these people will know where the Jewish communities are, where Jews are hiding.
Heydrich cynically labels these instigated pogroms self-cleansing.
One of the most ghastly incidents took place in Kaunas in Lithuania, when large numbers of elderly Jewish men were beaten to death by a person who became known as the death dealer of Kaunas. And he used an iron bar to kill significant numbers of people. The garage forecourt was awash with blood. And large numbers of German soldiers turned up.
It's almost tourism to see the mass killings of Jews in particular and others who were being murdered by the Einsatzgruppen and other methods as well. They sometimes take photographs. They sometimes write back to their loved ones saying, you know, I saw this thing today, but don't worry, my darling, because it has to be done.
The German instigators remain on the sidelines.
A lot of the amateur footage that is being taken and some of the organised film footage in the autumn 41 is being taken specifically to show that it's Lithuanians or Latvians doing the killing, not Germans. So the Germans who are ordering are kept out of the background and the people, the thugs who are doing the shooting, are shown, so that it's almost constructing a deceptive visible record to deceive.
At first, the invasion goes to plan. Taken by surprise and in total disarray, Red Army forces are brutally pushed back. The Wehrmacht is advancing up to 80 kilometers a day. Hot on their heels come the Einsatzgruppen, free to murder at will. Entire villages are wiped out on the pretext of hunting down partisans. The task forces work hand in glove with the Wehrmacht. The moment German armed forces capture an area, the killing can begin. In the early days, the German blitzkrieg appears unstoppable, just as it had been in Poland and France.
At first, the Wehrmacht had nothing but success. The Red Army suffered huge losses. During the frontier campaign from June 22nd to July 9th, 1941, the Soviets suffered 600,000 casualties, dead and wounded.
Walter Frenz, a German newsreel cameraman and Hitler's personal photographer, arrives at the front with a special assignment: to capture the moment of Germany's expected final victory over the Soviet Union. He records the destruction across Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. He's in a POW camp taking shots of captured Soviets. These are images of an army that has been routed, taken by a man convinced of final victory. Army medic Helmut Machemer is also busy documenting the Wehrmacht's triumphant progress. The Red Army seems on the brink of defeat, its air force decimated.
It was no illusion. The Wehrmacht was clearly stronger than the Red Army in the war's early stages, better trained and better prepared.
The Germans are encircling and capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, seen here in Machemer's cine films. What is to be done with them? Herbert Backe's plans provide the answer. They will be left to starve.
The treatment of the Soviet prisoners of war was absolutely despicable. Around about 1.2 million Soviet prisoners of war were taken and starved to death. This was not an SS crime. This was particularly a Wehrmacht crime. So they were taken to very often open enclosures with barbed wire and a few guards around them, given nothing to eat, no shelter. And they were murdered in their tens and tens and tens of thousands.
Staggering losses send waves of panic across Moscow. Just replacing the officers is a special problem.
He finds that most of his great officers have been either killed or in the Gulag. And General Rokossovsky, for example, comes to mind, who was in the Gulag at the time. He'd had his teeth kicked in. Well, he's rehabilitated and, of course, comes back to play an enormously important part in the war.
Luckily for Stalin, help is on offer, but from his capitalist class enemy. Within hours of the German attack, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is on the radio.
At 4 o'clock this morning, Hitler attacked and invaded Russia.
His speech is addressed to Stalin. Despite deep political aversion, he is offering British support.
He's a vehement anti-communist and anti-socialist. And his private secretary, Jock Colville, teases Churchill about, how he is now changing his opinions, apparently. And Churchill looks at Colville and he says, if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons.
Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder. So now this bloodthirsty gutter snipe must launch his mechanized armies upon new fields of slaughter, pillage and devastation.
The language is now very intemperate. If this invasion of the Soviet Union is successful, where will he stop? This man, Hitler, is bent on world domination. At the moment in history, Hitler is the enemy, the threat to the world. And anybody who's fighting him, we will support.
British generals give the Soviet Union at best 6 weeks. But Churchill is skeptical. He is convinced in 2 years' time they will still be fighting. On July the 12th, the British and the Soviets sign an agreement simultaneously in London and in Moscow.
It may well have been in this very room nearly 2 years ago that Ribbentrop, in the presence of Mr. Stalin, signed the Russo-German Pact of Non-Aggression, which, like all German contracts, was mentally torn up before the valueless Nazi signature was written.
The alliance against the Nazis grows stronger. There will be no more negotiating. Hitler has burned his bridges. This is Steinsdorf in Silesia. It's the summer of 1941, and an amateur filmmaker captures an everyday scene. A Polish forced laborer and a young German girl are being harassed in the street. Bronja and Gerhard are accused of being lovers, a Nazi race crime.
Dehumanizing people is the mechanism by which individuals or groups are singled out for exclusion from the wider community. And it's what makes it possible to act brutally against them in all sorts of specific ways, and eventually to kill them.
The whole village takes part in the ritual humiliation, including the youngsters. But they leave the actual killing to others. Bronja is sent to a camp, Gerhard to the front line. Neither survives the war.
When violence becomes every day in your society, then you no longer notice physical violations, and the exercise of violence becomes normalized in a way inconceivable in a time of peace.
Liepaja in Latvia, 1941. A German soldier is busy filming actions that are by now all too common in occupied territory.
Soldiers and sailors who've been having a nice dip in the sea on the Baltic coast after work all day are called in to come and watch.
This is mass murder in front of eager spectators.
Jews are being brought in there in trucks, are being unloaded from the trucks, made to run to the mass grave and are shot into it. And soldiers and sailors are lining up, sitting on top of the bunkers to get a better view. And many of them say in their accounts, we were ordered to come and see this. So this is a public spectacle.
It was commonplace for Germans to complain that the Einsatzgruppen hadn't done quite a good enough job because people were crawling out of the pits where they'd been shot into. And they were complaining because the Einsatzgruppen hadn't done a good enough job killing everybody. You know, this was the reversal of humanity, the reversal of what it means to respect another human life.
The mass murder of Soviet Jews begins from day one of the campaign. The SS continually refines its methods. SS General Friedrich Jeckeln devises what he calls sardining.
He layers them like sardines. He will take less space. So the victims are ordered to dig their own graves and then lie on the corpses of the already dead friends and families before they are murdered.
It's a kind of Fordism. You know, thinking of the American manufacturing system, how can we improve this process of mass murder? How can we improve these simple ingredients of this process, the pit and the rifle?
Head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who frequently tours the conquered areas, calls for only Jewish men to be shot. But after a few weeks, he extends the order to include women and children.
Very soon after the Germans marched into the Soviet Union, people began writing that the Jews living there would become the last generation to do so, that all of them, sooner or later, would have to be killed.
The mass murder of the Jews is not the result of uncontrolled outbreaks of violence. It has been planned and is carried out with bureaucratic thoroughness.
There was a race to declare the first territories in the East Judenfrei. And there are these extraordinary reports that come back looking like modern PowerPoint presentations with little coffins to represent the number of Jews that were killed by each part of the Einsatzgruppen.
SS troops in Lithuania ensure the death toll rises quickly there too. Urged on by their superiors, thrilled by the high numbers. On December the 1st, an SS officer draws up a balance sheet. His hunting report describes a total of 137,000 Jewish victims in 71 cities and villages.
The SS bureaucrats who are monitoring their progress and in many cases urging them to kill more people, kill more, take more action.
In the vicinity of Kiev alone, German task forces shoot over 33,000 Ukrainian Jews in 2 days.
About 2 million, although again the figures are very hard to ascertain, are committed by the Einsatzgruppen and other such groups and bodies, police battalions and so on, that are deliberately sent in by the SS for the specific reason of targeting and murdering people that the Nazis have identified as criminals or Jewish Bolsheviks or whatever label is put on these people.
Diese Horden, unter ihnen ungezählte Juden, sollten in Marsch gesetzt werden, die deutschen Städte und Dörfer in Schutt und Asche zu legen. Sie hätten ein Blutbad ohnegleichen unter unserer Bevölkerung angerichtet. Die Gesichter dieser Untermenschen sind von Raubgier und Mordlust gezeichnet. In der Tat würdige Verbündete Churchills und seiner Plutokratenklicke.
American President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill meet on August the 9th, 1941. Barely 4 weeks after signing the treaty with Stalin, Churchill arrives off the coast of Newfoundland on a battleship. Officially, the US remains neutral, whereas the British have been fighting Germany for 2 years.
Churchill went to Newfoundland expecting a declaration of war by the United States. What he got instead was a declaration of war aims.
They sign the Atlantic Charter, whose goal is a world at peace stripped of Nazis. It will provide the foundation stone for the later United Nations. Roosevelt reissues his order for US ships to attack German submarines in the Atlantic, even without a declaration of war. American merchant shipping heading for Britain is no longer fair game. The Germans have been warned. The world's most powerful economy mobilizes against the Nazis. Hitler can only respond with contempt.
What's striking, I think, about the United States is the feeling that the man who is, or the political leader, a man who is in a wheelchair, who cannot stand unaided, who can't dress himself unaided, the kind of person in the Third Reich would be got rid of. That adds, I think, to Hitler's contempt as well as hatred for the United States, run by the Jews, and they've got this Untermensch running the country in the Oval Office.
By the middle of summer 1941, however, there is ominously bad news for Germany from the east. The mighty Wehrmacht advance has halted. The Red Army is proving tougher than expected.
Nazi leadership, both Hitler and his generals, clearly underestimated the scale of Russia, their mobilization capacity, and even the Red Army's equipment. For example, the famous T-34 tank came as a total surprise to German panzer leaders. They had no idea of its existence. The USSR was also able to replace losses sustained by its 5 million strong Red Army in very short order by doubling conscription.
German losses rise dramatically. Volunteer army medic Helmut Machemer has a lot to do. There will be no easy blitzkrieg victory, just more and more murders.
We see two dynamics of escalation in August 1941. One is the slowing down of the Barbarossa offensive, which was supposed to have been done by August and is clearly going to stretch deep into the autumn. And the other logic is the external international escalation with the increasing moves towards an open commitment of the United States to the British war effort, which will culminate in the Atlantic Charter.
The German army is not prepared for a long war in the east. And in the West, the Allies are just getting stronger. For Hitler, there is only one explanation. In his worldview of race hatred, only one power would be able to unite Soviet Bolsheviks, British imperialists, and American capitalists against Germany.
The idea of a Jewish conspiracy ties together all sorts of otherwise ostensibly opposed elements.
Hitler's sense of a Jewish conspiracy is ubiquitous, it's everywhere.
6 months before the war began, Hitler connected the war with the idea of murdering Europe's Jews.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
the kind of rhetoric which, of course, is self-reinforcing. If you make a statement of that sort, it's pushing us down that road towards the final solution.
4 days after the publication of the Atlantic Charter, Hitler launches a tirade of hatred against each of its 8 paragraphs. Goebbels records in his diary,
"The Führer is convinced that his prophecy is coming true, that if Judaism were to succeed in provoking another world war, it would end with the annihilation of the Jews."
Germany's so-called Jewish policy has become more radical since September 1941, as relations with America deteriorated. Everyone expects the United States to join the war sooner or later, and they feel justified taking European Jews hostage against this. You can only understand it if you look at it through Hitler's anti-Semitic tunnel vision, his anti-Semitic obsession.
The mass murder of Jews becomes a way to strike against London, Moscow, and soon enough Washington too. It's a strain of propaganda that many German soldiers believe. A German non-commissioned officer stationed in France writes,
"Now Jewry has declared war on us all along the line, from London and New York, plutocrats all the way to the Bolsheviks. Everything that is Jewish is in one front against us."
Around 170,000 Jews still live in the German Reich, discriminated against, marginalized, and impoverished. The Nazis regard them as deeply threatening. As of September 1941, they are ordered to wear the yellow star.
Till this point, the SS and the police had been unenthusiastic about marking the Jews with such a sign, because they were not sure how the wider population would react. But now, they knew it was fine.
Joseph Goebbels, head of Nazi propaganda, accuses the Jews of being to blame for their own fate.
The decision was reached in September 1941. First, to attack the Jews publicly, and then to deport them from Germany, which had not been the case before. A vote was called in the Nazi Party, with Goebbels and Karl Kaufmann, Gauleiter of Hamburg, applying pressure. And finally, Hitler agreed it was time to deport them.
German Jews are rounded up in open daylight. Local Nazi functionaries commission films to record it, proud of their actions. The first train leaves on October the 15th, bound for the Lodz ghetto, renamed Litzmannstadt by the Germans. Transports from Prague and Luxembourg follow the next day, and 3 days after that, from Berlin. By November the 5th, almost 20,000 people have been deported to the east. The second phase begins on November the 8th. 22,000 more Jews are sent to Riga, Kaunas, and Minsk.
The decision to deport German Jews leads to the conclusion that one also has to get rid of the Jews in the East, who occupy the places where the German Jews are to be settled. And by get rid of, they mean to destroy. There is a connection between the decision to deport German and Western European Jews and the decision that Jews who are already in the East must be systematically exterminated.
These deportations set off a chain reaction, driving Nazi Jewish policy in a terrible new direction. The ghettos in occupied Poland are overcrowded. Almost 3.5 million Polish Jews live there in inhuman conditions. Local Nazi functionaries want to get rid of them.
Bis dahin kursierten innerhalb des Reichssicherheitshauptamtes.
Till this point, the SS Reich Security Main Office has considered a number of different deportation plans, whose ultimate aim was that those Jews still living in Polish ghettos would be shipped to Siberia at a future date.
Sibirien deportiert werden würden.
First, the Soviet Union must be defeated, but it seems a long time coming. And all the while, tens of thousands of Jews deported from Western Europe are being dumped in the ghettos. Meanwhile, behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen genocide has not stopped. Head of the SS Heinrich Himmler wants to explore other methods. Not out of concern for the victims, but for his executioners.
We have this chilling document where one of the Einsatzgruppen members complains that they are given Blattsausage, Blutwurst, for lunch after standing up to their knees in blood the whole day.
Then, in autumn 1941, their crime against humanity escalates still further.
A decision is reached. The Jews must be exterminated. It was intended that many should die through hunger, deportations, and work to the point of exhaustion. Then there are the Einsatzgruppen, who are trained and experienced mass executioners.
Mass shooting,
But shooting is not good enough either. And he concludes, well, let's find a better method.
The most promising method, gas. Hitler had known this ever since the start of the war. Words become actions.
Then they fall back on ideas originated by the so-called T4 campaign, which saw the murder of the supposedly mentally ill with carbon monoxide gas. So they experiment with gas vans, that is, trucks whose exhaust gases are piped back into the rear compartments.
Between 1940 and 1941, the Nazis murder 70,000 Germans with disabilities. The men responsible head east to support the Einsatzgruppen with their mass killings. The SS start their own experiments with poison gas in camps such as Auschwitz. Camp officials are keen to provide solutions to SS leadership. At the start of September 1941, Zyklon B, a hydrogen cyanide gas, is used for the first time. 600 Soviet POWs and 250 camp inmates are murdered in a barracks cellar. The Auschwitz camp staff hail it a great success.
The Germans had wanted to accelerate the extermination ever since early 1942. They were on the hunt for new killing methods and settled on the idea of using gas chambers. But in actual fact, if we study the statistics, more Jews were killed by shooting than in the gas chambers during the Holocaust.
In a small North German town, a Wehrmacht officer cheerfully films his soldiers teaching the locals how to shoot and throw hand grenades. Everyone, including the women, want to have a go. Especially enjoyable is throwing balls at effigies of Churchill and Stalin. The Eastern Front feels a world away. But knowledge of the killings has already reached Germany. Soldiers on leave are full of stories of what they've seen in the East.
I think the knowledge of killings is already enormous in the summer and autumn of 1941. The killings on the Eastern Front are extremely public.
This isn't the only terrible news emanating from the East.
We thought the whole thing was collapsing. I mean, we've advanced hundreds of miles and captured tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but the Russians keep coming back. And by December, they're having to admit they can't capture Moscow. They're stopped in the snow.
Like millions of other German soldiers, Army medic Helmut Machemer has barely any winter clothing or equipment to deal with the Russian cold. But his resolution does not waver. He is determined to win his Iron Cross and protect his family. He writes home.
You should now have a clear picture of our struggles from my letters, which I am sending you now, so long as you promise not to get upset. What help is that? I'm here, and I must just bear it.
Machemer achieves his final goal, winning his Iron Cross. His wife and children are reclassified as German-blooded. Despite their Jewish background, they are not persecuted. It's the only known case of its kind. In May 1942, Helmut Machemer is killed by shrapnel. Erna and their children survive the war. December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the most important American naval base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Americans enter the war. Hitler's Japanese allies conquer huge areas of the Pacific in the months that follow. The Americans and the British are reeling. The threat even reaches Australia. The Second World War is now truly global. Hitler is relieved. How can the Americans threaten him in Europe if they have their backs to the wall in the Pacific? In an act of megalomania, Hitler declares war on the US 4 days later.
It's better, psychologically, to declare war on somebody else than have the war declared on you. That's part almost of the mentality of the martial race.
5 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler holds a meeting in his private apartment. Goebbels recounts the conversation in his diary.
With regard to the Jewish question, the Führer wants to wipe the slate clean. That's not just a turn of phrase. Global war is here, and the annihilation of world Jewry must be its necessary consequence.
This is another watershed in the story. The Nazis realized that the war won't be over in 1941, and that makes them contemplate even more radical action against the Jews. The sequence of events in the war are cumulatively driving ever more radical measures.
Reversals on the Eastern Front make the Nazis tighten the screws of their Jewish policy. Hinrich Lohse, Reich Commissar for the East, had asked back in November, is the extermination of the Jews now official Nazi policy? He finally gets his answer. Yes, it is. Hans Frank, the governor of occupied Poland, returns to Krakow from a meeting with Nazi leadership in Berlin. On December the 16th, he tells his subordinates, the Jews are going to be liquidated. The signs are clear, but is there a single written order from Hitler himself?
There could be no order, neither written nor even verbal. That was not how Hitler operated.
Far more likely, Hitler approves and reinforces what is already underway. The entire regime regards the Holocaust as its most important project.
That implies a decentered agency, many collaborating agencies involved in this process, driving this violence from a series of centers within the Third Reich rather than the guiding hand of one single maniacal anti-Semite.
Many are involved in the murder of the Jews. SS, Einsatzgruppen, Wehrmacht, the German occupation authorities. All they lack is central coordination. To help achieve this, a meeting is held on January the 20th, 1942. Today we know it as the Wannsee Conference. Chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, SS authorities and government ministry officials meet to discuss the final solution of the Jewish question, the murder of every Jew in Europe. Adolf Eichmann, officer in charge of Jewish affairs in the SS, shares a list of those who should die, a total of 11 million people.
In fact, genocide was already well underway. In other words, the meeting was more concerned with technical issues on the one hand, and the question of who takes on the leadership role on the other, with the SS staking a very clear claim to power.
Two things are now clear. First, mass murder will no longer be postponed till after the war. It is to be stepped up immediately. Secondly, the Nazis have every Jew in East and West Europe in their sights. Their crime would be enormous, executed with bureaucratic efficiency and without mercy.
When one looks at the final solution as an evolving project, one almost never sees a step taken backwards. The radicalization is always in the direction of more extreme, more inclusive. This is a much more terrifying view than the view of a thoroughly Führer-centric system in which blueprints are handed out and everyone else fills in the details.
The war staggers on, piling up ever more victims. Deep behind the front lines, a previously inconceivable murder plan takes its course. Hundreds of thousands of perpetrators, millions of victims, share the same destination, the Nazi death camps.